Well, thank
Hold it,
you.
Jason. Hold it, Jason.
Yeah.
Eric who and what's his position?
What'd you say? Oh, I'll let Eric introduce himself, give
Okay.
his journey,
Ah,
because he's no longer at Laverne anymore.
well, good morning, and I'm Eric Bishop, and I'm from Laverne area. I'm a member of the Laverne Church of the Brethren, and I am a part-time faculty member at the University of Laverne, but my full-time job now is I work at a community college in Northern California called Ohlone Community College as the superintendent president of that college. And I just began that in July, so it's all new. I am living up and down the state as my family is still in Southern California. And so we go back and forth over the weekends. And this is a weekend I'm staying up here. They're still down there because I had Bethany board meetings. And so it didn't make sense for me to travel since I was spending my days and sitting in front of the computer at meetings anyways. But so it worked out perfect that, I was able to visit and be with you guys this morning and try to have a conversation. And Jason said, yeah, some folks were at your symposium and they wanted to see if you wanted to come. And I'm like people really still want to hear me after that. So it's exciting. And as I said, as some of you were on early, E-Town is like a sister church for us. And so anything for Elizabethtown and happy to be here. And I told Jason, I do have some slides I want to share, but I think mostly I'm hoping just to have a conversation, kind of see where you're at, what you want to know, what questions I can answer, and go from there. So I really want, hope for this to be, pretty give and take, because me lecturing at you is not necessarily my forte, but it will hopefully help get the conversation started. And I understand that you've been having some conversations, about race. And this has been to give you context of where this has come for me. It's probably been, 4 or 5 years now that this kind of conversation and thought line has been on my mind, starting really with the murder of Trayvon Martin. And then, we had Michael Brown and Eric Gardner. And so as those progressed, and as Ferguson kind of erupted, it became this space for me of, okay, where am I supposed to feel in this? How does this settle with me? And not that it was new and it was really kind of something I've grown up with my life. I grew up in Los Angeles, California. And so I grew up under the shadow of a police chief who believed that the chokehold was one of the best tactics for police, and that the reason that so many African Americans died from the chokehold was because our anatomy was inferior and different. And so that's kind of the specter. But the more recent, this last half decade, really what's clouded it and kind of raised my consciousness and my thought processes. How does it resonate with my peace stance and my pacifism and my membership in the Church of the Brethren? And I found that to be a difficult journey for me as I've gone in thinking about how do I, as someone this is part of my background, being Black in America is part of my background, and yet my pacifism is part of my background. I think Jason said one of the resources that he shared was the sermon that I did at Highland Avenue, and the key for that is that even if I came to the Church of the Brethren later in life, I've always felt like the values of the church were with me. So as I like to say, I was brethren. I've always been brethren. I just didn't know it until after I graduated from college. And so the question has been, where is my church in this conversation? And mostly meaning the larger denomination. Where is the church in terms of that voice for me, in terms of calling out injustice, and in terms of representing my voice and me? and knowing that, I'm a very distinct minority in the Church of the Brethren, it really began to be unsettling to the point where is this a space for me? Is this a church for which I should belong and is appropriate? And even though, my brethren beliefs are embedded in me, I grew up in a fairly aggressive, violent background. So the idea of what peace meant and what justice meant, and that peacemaking is a verb, in my mind, and so peacemaking is active. And so the context has become to ask those questions and to begin to think about that and begin to think about my membership. And so I did the article for Messenger, and I taught the class for Brethren Academy but I also realized that part of the nature of the church to which I belong is that there are very few voices of mine in the church. And it doesn't mean that people aren't resonant with me. It's that the church doesn't know how to engage in the conversation. When they had the protest in Ferguson, kind of when this really all started, Gene Davies and Sandra Wagner, two members I know who went to Ferguson and were part of the protest. And that felt to me like, okay, that is my pacifism in action. That's justice making in action. But even just hearing the voice of the denomination to call out what was going on, and that lack of voice was very deafening for me. It was very loud that I didn't hear. And so that's part of what raised the question. And so then the conversation, well, what does it mean to be a peace church? Because I know historically when I went to membership and I started learning about the church, that the church as a peace church was all war is sin was the conversation. And so really, what does that look like? What are wars? And war is a term that we've come to use pretty colloquially in our society now. The war on poverty, the war on drugs, the war on crime. And very often those wars tend to be centered on Black and brown people, and they wind up being the victim of them. So that's kind of the context with which this conversation started. And then Paul Roth, who is part of the Brethren Mennonite Historical Association, saw that I did an insight session with annual conference. And so I don't want to say it's been a roadshow. It's been kind of interesting just in time, more and more people were asking the question. But the reality that there are churches within our denomination who don't know the questions to ask, or don't know how to ask the question, and don't even know that the conversation is one that we had in the congregation, because there may or may not be persons of color in the congregation, which means there may or may not be anyone who is dealing with it directly. And so in that case, the congregation doesn't even realize that it should be having a voice in this conversation, because it's not relevant or local to that congregation. And so that became kind of the litmus test. And I think that when I think about it, that's the church at large. And sometimes all we're asking for is a statement on the injustice going on in society. This week was a really hard one because of the lack of indictments in the Breonna Taylor death. And so in my job as a president, I had to release a statement for my community. And I saw yesterday through Newsline that NCC, the National Council of Churches, released a statement. And it was kind of that reminder that, there's, nothing from the Church of the Brethren, nothing from a historic peace church, nothing from what, in my mind, peace and justice go together, what I've really begun to think about as a justice church, or I hope would be a justice church. So that begins the context, or begets the context by which I think Jason asked me to be here and you guys asked me to be here. So I have a short PowerPoint I want to run through just with some notes to kind of share. And then I'm going to try to monitor if you have questions. Or Jason can, if he sees someone's raising their hand, either on the screen or through the participants bar can interrupt me, because I'm happy to have this be interactive, but just to give you a sense of.
I would encourage anyone to type into the chat too. I have that open, and that'd be a great way for me to be able to jump in with any questions.
So let me share. So I tailored it a little bit. So race in the congregation has been one of the themes in which I've done that since. I tailored it a little bit to Elizabethtown as we go through. And let me get, yeah. And so this has been kind of a sense of feeling that I think a quote that I resonated with by James Baldwin, that to be Negro in this country and to be relatively conscious is to be in rage almost all the time. So that the first problem is how to control that rage so it won't destroy you. And that part of the rage is this: it isn't only what is happening to you, but it's what's happening all around you all the time. In the face of the most extraordinary and criminal indifference, the indifference and ignorance of most white people in the country. And I think there's more these days allies than we've seen in recent decades, or maybe since the civil rights movement. And it's not lost on me that the Church of the Brethren was very prominent in the civil rights movement, very prominent in the marches and the peace protests, and which is why when I was looking at the church, it became such a draw and such a reason. Like I felt like it was part of me already. And I think because of that history, the lack of voice now is part of what is a struggle for me. How do we get here? So it's this current sense of, for me, wanting to have my spiritual community be part of the feelings that I have and understand those feelings and be a voice for me, and recognizing that lack of that's been, defining I have to be my own voice. I'm very fortunate that, as I think I said, I feel like Elizabethtown is a sister congregation to the Laverne congregation. We're alike in so many ways, and my congregation has really taken this up in terms of creating committees that look at peace and justice and race on a regular basis, releasing statements of injustice on their own. I think it became that piece of not waiting for the denomination to do it and not waiting for it to come from Elgin, but saying, within our own community, we can make a voice and take a stand and do that. And so that's really helped. The new day, that new day is that definition of what war is. The wars, as we thought about them historically as the militaristic country versus country, have changed. The war on terror, the war, all these spaces really make us question our pacifism and our stand for justice, in my mind. Because how do you define war has to become a fundamental conversation, I think, in our society, because it's real easy, if we think about war in the historic and normal context, to think, well, we're not really in war, so there's not really a voice that we need to put forth. But when we think about all these little societal declared wars, then maybe there is a space. It's not declared a war, but when you think about the criminality that's happening and still happening in Flint, Michigan, right, which is largely a community of color, and where's our voice there? Where's our space there in terms of peace and justice? So, and that's what makes the incongruity of being Black and pacifism so difficult. And to note that Blackness and African Americanism isn't monolithic, and so it's so defined by where you come from, whether you're urban, rural, suburban, what your background is, what your socioeconomics, that's all plays a part in our Blackness and in who we are and how we relate to to society in some respects. I grew up in the city of Los Angeles. I grew up around crime and drugs. I grew up around, police abuse. And so that has a context for me in which I see society today and shapes me in a way that to some degree makes being a pacifist incongruent. But I can see beyond that, the bigger picture, which is why I so feel like this is the space I'm in. And that defining Blackness, we even within the African-American community have so many different viewpoints and spaces and so don't want to be broad brushed and painted with one brush. And I always say that the voice you're hearing is my voice. And there are others who would agree, but it's a singular voice. And so you're getting a singular perspective, and you may, speak to someone else and get a completely different perspective. And I think I'm here because of these, my life has been, et cetera. I grew up was in my 20s when the Rodney King beating happened. And I remember thinking, oh, finally, it's on tape. This is going to change everything. Because it wasn't that it was news, just that it had been videotaped for the first time. Only it wasn't, right? It didn't change everything, because that was clear.
Sorry, everyone. It looks like we lost Eric there.
Am I back now?
Oh, hey-oh. Yep, you're back.
I don't know what happened.
Great. I was about to say we lost Eric.
And so, so that makes part of it. But it's, the conversation is all about police these days, but it's not necessarily just about police. That's, in some respects, that's the governmental influence. But Ahmaud Arbery was not, a police situation. Trayvon Martin was not a police situation. That was, in some respects, a war on Blackness, because they were killed by private citizens. So, it's the larger societal context. And so I think part of the question that we have that I have, and I shouldn't say that I have, is pacifism just watching? And what does peacemaking look like? Because I in my head, I've seen my peace, I see peace as a verb and not an adjective. So to make peace is actually engage in a space that is not peaceful to try to bring peace about, which is why I relate it so much to justice making. Like it's to stop injustice and to step in front of it. Christian peacemaker teams have always been an organization that I've idolized because of their willingness to step in the middle of the conflict. And I've always thought that even if you think about just in school on the playground, if you have two people fighting, the only way to end the fight is to step in the middle of it, which means you put yourself at risk. And that's really what the peacemaking and justice making are. Mark Lamont Hill wrote a book called Nobody, and that was one of the resources I used both in my class, and just it was a fantastic read for me. And this is one of the quotes from the preface. It says, "To be nobody is to be vulnerable. In the most basic sense, all of us are vulnerable. To be human is to be susceptible to misfortune, violence, illness, and death. The role of government, however, is to offer forms of protection that enhance our lives and shield our bodies from foreseeable and preventable dangers. Unfortunately, for many citizens, particularly those marked as poor, Black, brown, immigrant, queer, and trans, state power has only increased their vulnerability, making their lives more rather than less unsafe." And that really sticks with me, because as much as this is a Black and brown issue, it also is a socioeconomic issue. And it's not lost on me that historically, if we think about it, and I wasn't there, so this is just my interpretation, that Dr. King's life became more at risk when he started the Poor People's Campaign as much as when he was doing the civil rights movement. Because when he started shaking the economic structures, that's when the discomfort really started. If we think about where we're still at, we still are having the immigration issue. The nature of our society right now is we're very short memory. So things go quickly and they come and go and we forget about them. But we still have immigrants locked up, and we're not talking about that anymore. We have to think about the new conversation of anti-racism and being an anti-racist, and those are intentional decisions. Those are things we have to really decide to do, and we have to decide, what does it mean to be a peace church, and should we kind of consider ourselves a peace and justice church? And of course, John Lewis's quote has been very in the news lately. You must find a way to get in the way and get in good trouble, necessary trouble. You have a moral obligation, a mission, and a mandate. When you leave here to go out and seek justice for all, you can do it, you must do it, which he received from Martin Luther King. So how do we get there and where do we go? I think part of the challenge is challenging structures of racism, what I've called in turn institutional pillars, policies, budgeting, hiring, and education. And if I think about that in a congregational church context, I think your policies are, does the congregation have a statement, or has it said out loud that we are an anti-racist church? We are a church who believes in diversity, equity, and inclusion. Are we budgeting and putting our funding along those lines? And hiring, is less so in the church, but when we call people to commissions and the committees, is that a framework with which we're thinking in terms of our leadership? And then what are we doing in terms of educating each other within the church? And this is an example of a church who's doing a proactive education, to inform itself and to do that. And then there's a number of resources that I have relied on. There's so many more out there. These are just some that I've kind of picked up, and I'll make sure Jason has this list. And there have been 2 annual conference statements that I've used for kind of this work. One is the 1991 Brethren in Black Americans statement, of which I would say is actually a really good statement. And it's just honestly, and we've talked about this in my congregation, we've just never really done it or lived into it. And it can be as relevant today. But I think that's the nature of part of the way we operate as a church, is we do pass things at annual conference, but church is a local thing. And so the things we do at the denominational level don't make it back down to the congregation. And so when you look at the statement and you read it, it actually becomes a piece like, oh, is that what we're supposed to do? But most people have never seen it, never read it, and don't really know because it doesn't make it back. And Separate No More was the latest statement from 2007. And I'll show you my brethrenism, because what I can say is that was the Cleveland conference. And I remember being there for that conference. But I remember the conversation on the floor of annual conference was very largely about, we want to be, a welcome and open and inclusion, and we want people to join us. But the conversation was very much about assimilation, about, well, we want them to be us when they join us. And so that's kind of the presentation. I think now it's just, kind of say you have some of my thought processes, some of where I come from with it. And this is where maybe we can just have a conversation and answer, Q&A, and you can pick my brain and talk about where you are and what you want and how I can help and how I can be, part of you is really, I think, in my mind, why I'm here. So
Great. Eric, thank you. Thank you for sharing with us. Briefly, I do have a number of questions that come in the chat. So I have some of those questions for you, but briefly, just for everyone who's joining us here, just a little bit of background. And I don't know if Julie or anyone else wants to jump in about this, but I think some of you are aware, not everyone, maybe, that we have had an anti-racism group that was meeting since July, I believe, that started as an educational group, but kind of morphed into more of a group that was looking at our own congregation and what were some of the steps that we could take, developing statements and a number of things. So just for some background for individuals, that is currently happening, and part of the context in which we've asked Eric to be with us here today. So we can talk a little bit more about that to some degree, but also just note that wheels are moving with that, and you'll be hearing more about that over the coming weeks. But Eric, a question that is here in the chat, and I'm just going to try to sum it up, is basically that could you share a little bit of insight, or maybe just how you process some of the things about how you hold in tension this idea of pacifism and non-resistance, but also protests that are happening, peace marches, and the question here says MLK's peace marches and John Lewis's when you see something, do something, and a pacifism stand. So how is it to be active and passive? How do you hold those things in tension for yourself? How can you help us think about that too, maybe?
Yeah, that question is one that resonates with me a lot in terms of, particularly as we think about the protests and the marches, and we've been having marches for, half a decade now, but they're getting attention now. And I think part of that is because the marches have become bigger. And honestly, I think the thing that's really key now is the marches have more allies. I think when we saw the marches following George Floyd's death this summer, one of the real striking images of that was that the lines between the protesters and the police force were, in many cities and in many cases, largely our white brethren and white protesters who intentionally set themselves there because they actually knew that there was the likelihood of the police reacting was lessened because they were the ones right in front of them. That had that line of protesters in front of the police been Black protesters, that the escalation probably would have escalated much quicker. And so I actually haven't protested, and that's one of the things I struggle with. And because of the era of COVID, and because I'm trying to figure out where do I find that space between that walk and, protecting my family, my daughter, and not being out in that space to prevent the spread. But I think so where I come back with that is my protests are in my realm of expertise. So, and I think that's where all of us can come in terms of what is it that I can offer. For some people, they have the time and energy to be in the streets. For me, I'm an educator and I am a leader in education. And so my protest is changing and dismantling the system with which I have a voice and a space to change. So, come into So on Thursday, I had an event at school in which we call it peaceful protests, which are virtual. And it became very clear to me that a number of my faculty and staff were hurting and in pain because of the failure to indict the officers in Louisville. And so I released a statement. And so I'm doing very intentional activities where we are creating policies that are, one, anti-racist, and two, geared towards diversity, equity, and inclusion. So everything we do, every hire, we're moving to a point where every decision is through a lens of equity. That's part of where I can control my destiny. And I'm actually working on a curriculum with which to speak with our local police department to say, let's talk about what policing looks like in our community and how can we as an educational institution partner with that so it lightens that pressure that you're feeling, maybe brings some more educated folks, moves our police from this front line of hostility and lets them do the job of which they want to do it. So, I think so part of it is you have to work within what your strength is and what you can do. And mine is education. And so I can make historic change in that way. But I'm always wrestling with what's morally right. And I think that's where my pacifism, comes in. What is the moral question in that?
Great. Another question I want to jump down to here is, I'm a lifelong Brethren. My husband is new to the Brethren 4 years ago. He feels like people are colorblind when they look at him. He is assumed to be culturally white, and his blackness is not recognized when it is a primary part of him. How does a congregation that has grown up being intentionally colorblind see people of color in their struggle? It's a good question. Yeah.
That's that question. This is where we have to adapt to societal changes. There was a space in the time where being colorblind was acceptable, where colorblind was the right place to be. But we're in a new era of consciousness now. So colorblind is actually an offensive comment now, right? And so you don't want to be a colorblind church or a colorblind congregation. You want to see color, because actually to be colorblind means you are not seeing me for who I am, which means you are, in some respects, not recognizing my blackness. And so that's where your husband is that the color blindness actually means he's not recognized. And so it's important that we begin to move to a space that we not only see everyone's color, we recognize everyone's color, and we welcome it and enjoy it and recognize the richness with which having multiple colors in the kaleidoscope together actually is the value of the intentionality and inclusiveness, right? You can't be inclusive and be colorblind, because you are actually washing away everyone's color when you say you're colorblind. And so that there's the disconnect between inclusivity and colorblindness. So part of it is, I would just say, is he needs to figure out that space to just let people know but that's always about his comfort level, and to help educate and be part of that process so he's comfortable, but to not give up.
Another question, I guess, a comment you had made, could you elaborate on how state power makes things worse?
Yeah, I think, and so systems, my kind of latest theory, and that I've been talking with my folks about, is systems will bend, but they won't break. And the system will only bend so much before it pushes back. And I think that's what we're seeing now, right? I think in July, it was great to protest, and now we are seeing the system say, oh, no, that's enough, because if we allow too much pushing, then we might actually change. We might actually have to change the system. And so the system's pushing back. I think the state, we're not of the state, right? The state has always been non-representative. And because if you look at how those who govern and those who make decisions for us, they rarely look like us. And even when they do, they rarely are of the mindset that we're in. And that's been one of the things. So I'm an institutional leader. And so I have to really be cognizant that I have to be that leader and own who I am in this time. And the easiest thing for me to do is to allow the system, and I'm kind of relating that to the state, to say, oh, I have to work within the rules that I've been given. And ironically, the thing I've been given the freedom to do and have decided to do is to say, no, I need to change the rules to make it work for the people who it needs to serve. I need to change the policies. And so every day when I'm looking at making a decision, I have to, I question myself to say, oh, this is, and I have to stop myself and say, if I'm actually changing it, then why do I have to do it that way? Why can't I do it a new way? Why can't, if I've decided that policies, hiring, budget, and curriculum are my 4 pillars, then okay, I need to spend more money on that, and I need to put my resources there. And that has to be a very conscious decision. But that means that I'm willing to risk my power. And I think the state is rarely willing to risk power. You know, we're in a situation now where we have a leader who's saying that he may not hand over a peaceful transition, you know, a transition to power. And rarely do we see people in power hand over their power easily, whether that's a governor, a congressperson, a state representative, a mayor. You know, they hold on to that. And so they will put a system in place and keep a system in place that protects their privilege in that seat.
There's another question here about someone saying that they fear time will pass and protests will decline and nothing will change, as typically happens, and another issue will come in and kind of suck the life out of. So do you have any thoughts on anyone or any group that maybe you're excited about that politically maybe, or who's currently trying to establish a plan to for healing racism?
No. You know, it's interesting because we adapt with time, right? And people and systems adapt. And one of the greatest examples I have of that is the Vietnam War, right? When we think about the Vietnam War, it was called the dinner war because it was, you know, people sat and watched the war on TV during dinner time to watch the news to see if they could see their loved ones. But it was also probably the first war that the American people really didn't just march along with the state, and the consciousness of society was different. And so when we think about our government today and our military leaders today, what we have is we have a group of leaders who were sergeants, captains, lieutenants in the Vietnam War, who saw that effect. And so we began to see in the 80s that realization of, wait a minute, this is what the media did. This is what happened with the Vietnam War. We're not going to do that. So wars became more secret, so they adapted. And so I think we're seeing that now, like as we do this, you know, it's to give an example, Black Lives Matter has been crucified of late, right? It's become this, it's now a terrorist organization. It's all that. When I think that's an adaptation of a group whose mission is to bring consciousness. What we're seeing are dirty tricks and dirty politics, right? If you watch the news and you pay attention closely, you'll see that their protests, which are largely peaceful, and who weren't peaceful when they started, but their adaptation was, and I know I saw this when I was in Los Angeles, they were working with Los Angeles police and Los Angeles sheriff saying, this is going to be our protest. This is where we're going to be. This is where we're going to march. So they were in line to have their protests and keep them peaceful. But, you know, the counter side did everything it could to make them not peaceful, to make it look like this was an anti-organization. And that's what happened. So that the other side, both sides get smarter. So Black Lives Matter got smart and said, well, if we work with law enforcement and with the system, we'll have a much better outcome for our protests. The counter side did the same thing, where they said, oh, well, let's go in and make it, you know, disruptive and unpeaceful. So it looks like and it turns American society against it. And that piece about that time piece, that's what we're seeing, right? Everybody was Black Lives Matter, and now we're not, like, everybody's over it. The one thing about this current context and conversation is that I can almost say as a fact is that the reason it's hard to think that it will go away is because it won't. Because we know, as a Black American, as a Black male American who drives a car every day, who is constantly looking over my shoulder, who suddenly is living with the realization that an illegal lane change could be what cost me my life, right? So if I forget the signal, I have that realization.
Thank
that
you.
we all know we're just waiting for the next one, and the next one will bring it back. So this is one of those pieces of history that just won't stop occurring. So the conversation won't stop, because the question is, will society get tired of the conversation, right? And I think the society had gotten tired of it until we saw the direct inhumanity towards George Floyd, right? Which came on top of Ahmaud Arbery, who was chased down in Georgia. But at the same time, I know that within the next 6 months, it'll be back. And so it'll rear its head again. It's just a matter of how much tolerance people have to actually change, the systems. But yeah, the system will wait, because our attention spans aren't that long.
Pastor Bishop. Pastor Bishop,
Yes.
this is John. I recall when I was 18 at Lancaster Mennonite High School, figuring out if I'm going to go into the Army or be a traditional Mennonite pacifist. And looking at the Vietnam War, a lot of people are not aware that the Vietnam War was the first time, because of the evolution of the protesting, that non-peace church persons who were in the Army were actually allowed to become non-resistant pacifists and get out. And they did in large numbers, but it took a real grilling in front of a group to make sure they were sincere and not yellow bellies running from the horrible war in the jungle. As you may know, a lot of Mennonites went to Canada, and other peace church people went to Canada. One of my friends was one of those. But I remember Kent State and all of the things that were part of that bedroom TV mealtime TV, and the horror of all of the numbers, and the civilian losses are always way more than the military losses, but it was even worse in that jungle warfare. And I just wanted to know, from a Mennonite or Brethren background, and the Quakers, Mennonites, and Brethren, and the other splinter groups that came out of the Reformation were always considered peace churches. And it was as easy as telling your pastor saying you're non-resistant to go to the Selective Service Board. The other thing that happened when I was 18, the lottery came about, and we had a volunteer army for the first time. And so it wasn't automatic that you could just be a peace church person and forget about the war. I still had to draw a lottery number, and I drew a low number. And as a friend told me, I was disgustingly healthy and couldn't fail my physical, so I knew I had to go. So then I became a respiratory therapist, and it became my career. And I have many other friends and Mennonites and Brethren that got into that profession because we were mechanical farm boys, and we had a lot of mechanical equipment to run to be respiratory therapists. I just wanted to know if you would comment on the peace churches, and a lot of the Mennonite churches back then, and I don't know about the Brethrens, it was a test of membership, whether you went to the service or didn't. So if you chose, in my congregation in Eastern Pennsylvania, to go to the Army, you were no longer a member of that church. And that has changed in that same congregation to a more inclusive, open feeling of we're here for everyone. It's just because it became a large community church of non-Mennonites that happened.
Yeah, my understanding is that there was a point in time where you could not be in the military and be within one of the peace churches, and I know that existed in the Church of the Brethren. I know that has changed a little bit in many churches, because I know that part of the conversation has been my time in the church, which is really going on like 25 years or so, has been centered around the individual versus the system of war, right? And so that it's more about the government sanctioning of war versus that individual's involvement in the military. And so, but we've also seen, in the last 3 or 4 decades, the rise in flags in churches, the paralleling of nationalism in the church. And I'm gonna make a plug, and I don't know if I'm stepping out on a limb here, but I think one of the things that's happened within our church, and I don't know if this exists in the other 2 peace churches, is I think part of it is our theological education that has changed our church, particularly I'd say in the last 2 decades, when we're seeing within our church, our church leadership, our theological leadership, be more come from other traditions and be able to lead without the knowledge and history of the church and understanding what it means to be a historic peace church and what it means to be brethren. And so I'm always thinking in my head about if that one of the places it'd be great is if our pastors all were either graduates of Bethany Seminary or had some sort of requirement to be learned about the church in order to lead and be a brethren congregation, so that they have that understanding of what that means to be in conflict.
Amen, brother.
With the, with those forces of society that are contrary to who we are. So what we're seeing is the leadership within our congregations who are falling in line with the very systems that our church as a principle would be against. And so that's one of the struggles too. And as you know, I sit on the Bethany board. And so that's one of the places that's important to me, is to ensure that the leaders and the pastors that we educate are ready and equipped to deal with the current context of how to lead in the society, so that they're engaging in conversations like this, even if they're in the middle of Iowa or Kansas, and not afraid to engage.
There's a couple comments and some good dialogue happening in the chat. There's some people mentioning resources like the Poor People's Campaign and some other things. And recently there was a moderators town hall with Andrew Young. I don't know if you were able to see that at all.
I didn't know about it until after, and then I saw it. So I do.
Well, it's available now. Was I going to say to everyone, to let everyone know that the link came out, if that's something that people may be interested in watching. And I think that's helpful.
Our small group in our church is reading Wilkerson's book, Cast.
Yeah.
That's a good education.
Cast?
Yes.
Thank you. And you said Wilkerson, okay.
Isabel Wilkerson.
We're getting close to our time where we're gonna wrap up. We usually try to end sometime between 10:10 and 10:15. I think just a reminder to everyone that we are continuing to wrestle with these things as a congregation. And Eric, we are no surprise within the Church of the Brethren, we are a very white congregation by and large. I think sometimes individuals may think we're more diverse than we really are. But and so one of the challenges that I often hear is people who are desiring for a more diverse congregation, but it's reasonable to think that a person of color would not feel super comfortable walking into a congregation that's primarily white, and there's no like momentum to build those relationships necessarily. That's not a blanket statement, but just those are some of the concerns I've heard expressed. So what is something a congregation like ours can continue to do to maybe educate ourselves or build diversity or think about the different ways that we can be proactive as a peace and justice church?
I think the hardest piece, so if the desire to grow diversity is one of them, I think in my mind, there are a couple of ways to that. One is you do it through your actions and not what you say, right? If you are a church who believes in justice and who believes in equity and who believes in inclusivity, and that's who you are, and you say it and you live it and you do it, then and that's in your Sunday school materials, it's in your sermons, it's in, it's embedded in you, then when I walk into that congregation, I will resonate with that and I will feel that and I will feel welcome because you are talking about me, you are speaking for me, even though I'm not in the room. And I think one of the biggest challenges of our church is that because I'm not sitting there, it's not an issue. So I think what you're doing already is saying this is an issue, regardless of who's in the church. This is an issue we're tackling. That resonates with people. And then it's always hard. It takes a special person to be the only one or the one of few and to stick, right? Like I can walk in, but what does it take to get me back? And if I'm back, so then when someone else walks in and they see I'm there, it makes them a little more likely to want to come back. If I walk in and I see no one that looks like me, then there has to be something that makes me feel like I'm welcome, because I'll tell you, I'm going to walk into your congregation with a mindset of, am I going to be welcome here? Are people going to be looking at me funny? Am I going to be accepted? Is this a place where I'm going to be safe? Right? Doesn't matter if I know someone. That's the conversation that's going through someone's head. As I see more and more people who look like that, I'm still going to wonder those questions, but I'm more likely to come back and stay. And as I see more, then and if the messages are telling me that, and the relationships that I'm forming, like that's what's helped me remain in the church. Isn't the church polity, but it's the people, right? It's that wherever I've walked into, I have been made to feel like I'm welcome there, regardless of whether it was the most urban to the most rural churches. Those have made me feel like I'm safe. And I'm okay. Because at the end of the day, the one thing in my mind, the one thing in people who look like me's mind is, am I safe in this environment? Like, where are the exits? Where are the doors? How quickly am I going to need to get out? Like that's a real thought processor. And so the more that I sit there and hear and meet, and people actually aren't afraid to come and greet me and make me feel welcome and make me feel like I belong, the more I'm going to let that defense down. And the conversations you're having make me feel like I'm not alone in the things I'm thinking and the concerns I have. And that's the only way we're going to change, is for churches like yours to have these conversations, regardless of whether or not Eric Bishop is sitting in the pews, because when the time comes, you will be equipped to have the conversations, the difficult conversations. This is messy, but it's intentional and it's hard. And we don't always know, and we have to give ourselves permission to not know and to misstep.
Pastor Bishop, if I may say something, I think the best way churches grow is if each one brings one, and if each of us brings a person of color and makes them feel welcome in a setting of white folks, we can have a diverse church. We can bring people of Indian and Black heritage and Muslims and other faiths and have a diverse congregation if we all do our part.
And to go along with that is the other thing that is going to be on my head is tokenism. Like, are you bringing me because you need to have a Black person in the church? I know when I come to church at the Laverne congregation, not every Sunday, but I know over the course of a month, I am going to hear my choir sing gospel hymns. I'm going to hear my all white choir sing gospel hymns. I am going to have hymns in Spanish, even with very few Spanish. Like, so the service shows the inclusivity, even if I'm not there, right? And so that becomes part of it. If I'm sitting there and you're asking me to assimilate and just be you versus you showing that you're part of me as well, then that's not a welcoming church. So that's part of that institutional change, is to branch out and say, we're going to do things differently. We're going to sing these songs. We're going to do these scriptures. We're going to translate things. We're going to do these things different because they're inclusive, and not say, well, Eric, you just need to kind of do it the Brethren way, which is, in my mind, what the 2000 statement, Separate No More, is. We want you, but we want you to come be brethren, versus help teach us some more different ways in which brethrenness can exist.
Great. Hey, thank you so much. I did want to let everyone know that I put into the, at someone's request, I put into the chat the link for the Moderators Forum with Andrew Young. That did come across in a Newsline email if you happen to get those, but I did put that there if that's something you all want to copy and paste and use. Eric, EB, thanks thanks so much for being with us today. I appreciate it. We have a lot of work to do. We all have a lot of work to do. I know we do. But thank you for walking with us, for being with us here today. And I really appreciate it. So thank you very much.
And it's not too late to take a class at Bethany, so.
Right, yeah, right. You can enjoy the rest of your day now. I mean, it's still early. So.
It's a day of laundry and house cleaning. So you know how that goes. This is Sundays we come to, right? So thank you. I really appreciate the invitation and being part of, this conversation with Elizabethtown. And anytime I'm happy to, to come back or be in conversation with you, because in my mind, you are a kin church. And so, we're in this together. So I appreciate it.
Hey, thank you so much. You take care.
Thank you. Bye, Warren.
See everybody.